गंजी a taste of it.
I'm assuming.
I'm tasked to welcome each one of you for the first lecture in the GSP annual lecture series. As you know, the GSP is an international master's program which covers, you see, the 5 continents, and till now about 200 students from 60 different countries have completed the course. And JNU is a key partner in the GSP program, and we've been part of this program for about 11 years now. The annual lectures of the GSP program figure on topics relating to liberalization and globalization, and they have been recorded and made available in the DSA library for those of you who would like to look up for the past recordings of these lectures on various topics pertaining to liberalization and globalization. So on behalf of the Center and the GSP program, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Vasavi. She's currently a fellow at Nehru Memorial Museum Library. She has a PhD in social anthropology from Michigan. She taught at Tufts and at IIM Kozhikode. What is interesting is her work, which consists of a lot of field research, it started with the culture and agriculture, where she looks both at the social, economic and cultural aspects of the agricultural economy. She has also worked on primary education, carried out a multi-state study of the relationship between the community and the school as a key institution. And she's been part of an edited volume on the global IT industry located in Bangalore, and has also done a bit of work on translating Kannada writings on culture and society. She's made them available in English. And her most recent work, Shadow Space, you see, talks about farmers' suicide. It's a social anthropological study of the pervasive and distressing phenomenon of farmers' suicide. And unlike approaches which focus more only on economic indebtedness or other general issues, she has tried to look at the connection between economy, polity, society, culture and ecological issues in the study of agrarian distress. And her studies covered 5 states: Andhra, Karnataka, Kerala, Maharashtra and Punjab. And basically she has looked at suicide as a triple crisis of economy, society and ecology. And her talk today, which is also broadly would be covering these issues, will set out these points in a more, she might engage with these issues in greater length. So it is our pleasure that you are here, and you will be sharing your views. So I hand over the mic to Professor Vasavi.
Thank you, Dr. Sujata, and thank you to the department for inviting me here. And it's a pleasure to see Professor Vishwanathan, whom I've had the honor of knowing for the past 2 decades at least. Friends, what I want to do today with you is just very broadly share some ideas which I've been working on. So it's really not from this, Sujata, it's not from this earlier work. It's some kind of new work that I'm trying to look at what is happening to agriculture internationally on the global scenario. As many of you know, the topic of agriculture is really not popular or a fashionable subject of global studies. And what Anna Singh has called the charisma of social sciences of globalism, it barely finds a footnote. But I think if global studies must be comprehensive, they must pay attention to the conditions, to the agency, to the citizenship and to the representation of agriculturists. To do this, it means we have to go beyond what have been the dominant metaphors of global studies, especially the metaphors of flows associated with the transfer of technology, capital, media and labor, or with the new kind of metaphor that is gaining currency, which is the metaphor of assemblage, that there are cultures or social assemblages arising from a combination of new technologies, new capital, and new forms of labor, or new forms of science itself. If we must go beyond these dominant metaphors, and if we must pay attention to the significant ways in which there is restructuring and re-symbolization that are resulting from the complex forms in which the rural areas are being disembedded, and their new forms of re-embedding are taking place right across the world. To do this, what I've been trying to grapple with are the two contradictory, what I mean by antinomies, that is, contradictory perspectives on the same subject by a same agency, that is, global agencies or national agencies, policy-making agencies or economies, having contradictory stances on agriculture. Here, the two contradictory stances I look at are that of retrogression, seeing that agriculture is the anti-economy, it's retrogressive, it should decelerate vis-a-vis the urban, global, especially high technology, service-based industries that are emerging, versus the sudden ways in which agriculture or agriculturists must be rescued by a new form of global agendas, including forms of international philanthropy or the deployment of new forms of science and technology into vast areas of the world itself. So broadly looking at this, to look at both retrogression and rescue of agriculture that is taking place, I would say that we would have to look at what is called globalized governmentality, which is the ways in which global institutions, agents seek to control vast populations on agendas that are supposedly for the good of these populations, but which generate unanticipated results. These agendas represent globalized governmentality, which, as Nancy Fraser has elucidated, is represented by transnational and multiple players, not one single government or one agency, is dispersed widely across the world, or globe, is tremendously marketized, and its economic and political rationality includes crisis intervention and new forms of subjectivation across the world and also at many different levels. So this globalized governmentality of agriculture then entails remaking of vast and varied landscapes and then impacting the citizens of these areas and deploying both the language of the market, especially notions of productivity, higher productivity, and also enhancing profit, of encouraging agriculturists to become entrepreneurs through new forms of self-help or through transnational economic or promising them both transnational and economic benefits. If this is broadly what global agendas are seeking to do, the first kind of antinomy which has become very visible is that of retrogression. Here it is retrogression, I refer to prioritizing both urban, global industries over that of agriculture or of the rural areas. And since the governmentality of retrogression has been expedited, especially since 1990s, where what has been deployed is a narrative in which the rural and agriculture are placed in conditions of retrogression. These include disciplines and theoretical perspectives, including neoclassical economics, development theories, which assess agriculture itself to be secondary to industry, to urban and service economies, and proclaim especially the inevitable demise of small-scale agriculture. These recommendations include the shifting of surplus rural population into urban areas and following the path of industrial urban-led economic growth. Such statements have set the tone for what Akram Lodhi has called agro-skepticism, in which the rural and agriculture are seen as lacking any worth and therefore must be significantly altered, made redundant, or even removed. Attendant to these, to some of these key shifts are also dissemination of dominant images of agriculturists from all over the world. The starving peasant of Africa, the suicidal peasants of India, the left-inclined and ready-to-bear arms peasants of Latin America, the resilient peasant turned factory worker of vast countries of Southeast Asia, the peasant, the migrant peasant who is now working in the export-led factories of China, and also the exhausted small farmers of Europe and North America. All these stereotypes have only further legitimized their marginalization in both policy and planning, making both their demise not only inevitable, but expediting and legitimizing the extension of capital, new forms of financialization, including speculating on agricultural commodities, and the enforced, in some areas which we say enforced commercialization of food crops of agriculture over that of local food security systems. Reports such as that of the World Bank's World Development Report 2008, Agriculture for Development, considered both small-scale agriculture, non-capital agriculture, non-commercial agriculture as a laggard that needs to be re-engineered and replaced with other vibrant economic activities. Such plans included opening agriculture to private sector players, encouraging contract farming, and integrating agricultural economies into the larger global markets. Policy pronouncements advise both the globalization of agriculture with increased inputs of private capital, high technology, and new regimes of commercial inputs as the only solutions to the myriad problems of low productivity, food scarcity or food insecurity, and overall conditions of poverty in rural areas. What has been absent in many of these perspectives are the more appropriate and required policies which would look at most local specific issues and at structural issues which have actually led to some of these problems. Structural issues such as very skewed distribution of land or the lack of access to new resources such as capital, technology or commercial inputs itself. So, on to ideas of decentering agricultural research, making agricultural policy more democratic, or promoting even ecologically sensitive agriculture, thereby encouraging and ensuring both economic and political democracies and viabilities of these agrarian regimes. Some of the pressure brought on by the developing or underdeveloped countries, especially by WTO, GAS, European Union, OECD, NAFTA, and other agreements, have led the way, have become ways in which agricultural trade has not only been liberalized and the market terms are made favorable to purchasing countries. Some of the early results of these new kinds of trade agreements, especially the growing of crops of commercial crops for purchasing Western countries, has meant not only the imposition of transnational business interests over national and regional food security. Some of the results we saw there were in what have now become banana republics, especially in the Caribbean and southern Latin American countries. These banana republics produce not only exotic food crops for Western and developed markets, but also tyrants who then wreak havoc on local economies of these regions. The failure to address both these structural problems of regional policies has led to both conditions and events of extreme violence in which the most marginal and vulnerable cultivators are agriculturists or most vulnerable citizens are victims. The violence in large parts of Latin America over especially the previous 3 decades was completely linked to both the transnationalization of agriculture, the rendering of the vast coastal belt of Colombia, not just what is called the drug belts of Colombia, but the changing of the coast itself to growing oil palm and destroying local very varied cultures has also been very significant. For example, much of the violent conflicts in Africa are often rendered into ways in which they are constructed as ethnic conflict or conflict between tribes. But behind many of them are actually problems and issues related to access to land, access to resources have not been clarified, and therefore they are, those forms of violence are then seen as intergroup violence. The best example is that of Rwanda, where the intense and violent conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis is often in international discourse seen as long-standing historical enmity, but actual land-based and resource-based conflicts were typically have been overlooked. Events from around the world bear also witness to such rampant violations of both agrarian and agricultural interests. For example, the more recent, especially for the past decade, the promotion of biofuel production in Latin America, especially corn getting into ethanol production as an alternative to get rid of the fuel, petrol-based dependencies, the spread of what are called boom crops, cocoa, oil palm, coffee, and shrimp in Southeast Asia, the access to mineral belts by international mineral companies, including in India and very much in Southeast Asian countries and in Africa, and the continued promotion of export-led factories in China's agricultural belts are also examples of such violations of local specificities and locally required agrarian policies. Following some of these international policies and trends have also been national policies and legislations in which again there is both the mimicking or a seconding of such international recommendations of globalizing, externalizing and commercializing agriculture. So a coterie of compromised science administrators, policymakers and new consultants now formulate vision documents and long-term strategy planning for different countries in which agriculture as a livelihood and the conditions of conditions of local agriculture are targeted to be altered significantly. Many of these endorse market-based priorities of international agencies, agreements, such as national level documents, and such all these national documents rarely represent the ideas and views of agriculturists and remain largely absent from such policy and decision. All of whom, that is agriculturists, remain absent from decision-making processes. One recent example of such a draconian way in which national policies, agricultural policies, are made by bypassing the interests and the representation of agriculturists is that in the Indo-US Knowledge Initiative, which was brokered by Hillary Clinton. And it's an example of such a program where the key objective is to develop commercial agriculture and to promote biotechnologies led by transnational agencies. The Knowledge Initiative Board has representatives from the leading transnational companies, a few faculty from agricultural universities, from both the US and India, and a few Government of India representatives. But it is the absence of agriculturists and the representation that has been glaring. In bypassing these democratic processes, what the nation, the state is doing, and what so-called legislative processes are doing, is eroding the citizenship of agriculture. And here by citizenship, I don't mean just the civic and political citizenship, but citizenship in which agriculturists should have rights to both land, to resources, to capital, to know-how, and the rights to make decisions regarding their own livelihoods and their futures. So it is in bypassing these democratic processes and in the absence, which are all the more dangerous because there is an absence of effective regulatory mechanisms, that these agricultural agendas, global agendas, work against the interests of especially small and marginal agriculture. Another example linked to this has also been the huge debate about introducing and promoting genetically modified seeds, all of which are done by companies in cahoots with some scientists and administrators and politicians, without again consulting broad-based citizenship, not only just that of agriculture, but also of other citizens as consumers, and also of the future of people and lands. Linked to some of this and promoting some of, based on the extent to which there is this extension of various forms of agriculture across the world, is what is now being documented, especially just since the last 6 years or so, of what is called agri-imperialism. Such agricultural imperialism is not from what earlier documentation of the US or European countries getting into the underdeveloped countries. Rather, there are new players such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, China, India, and Brazil, which are expanding into vast terrains in both Latin America and Africa. New kinds of deals made between countries have enabled them to garner vast tracts of land only for commercial cultivation of crops to be exported back into their home countries. While China has already got several million acres in Africa, and the Chinese African policy is based very much on capturing land for production to be resent to China, India has also become a key player. For example, India alone has had vast tracts in both Ethiopia and in Kenya. One company alone, although based in Bangalore, has 100,000 acres leased to them from the government of Ethiopia, leading to both not only to the displacement of vast number of communities and to local agriculture, but creating both conditions of forced labor and forced cultivation of crops, for example, pulse, rice, and crops which are suitable for Indian consumption. The displacement of the Anuk indigenous community in the Gambela region of Ethiopia is also stark, and it is only very recently that people there are mobilizing against such agri-imperialism. So this current internationalization of agriculture sort of enhances not only existing structures of inequality, but it also introduces and abets various forms of risk linked to not only global warming, climate change, access of capital, forms of knowledge systems, etc., but it also avoids the problems of resource distribution, including economic and social development. Agricultural development itself is defined primarily as increasing production, and productivity itself has been made a trope for development itself. The end result has been a series of fallouts, both economic, social, and ecological, which are then encapsulated in worldwide crises of food, of energy, and of livelihoods. So these are very broadly the antinomy and the results of the antinomy of retrogression of seeing agriculture as secondary to that of the urban global economy. The second antinomy is that of rescuing agriculture, and more specifically rescuing agriculture, which is in some ways a result of or a response to the very depredations and forms of policies of retrogression imposed on vast tracts of land and vast numbers of agrarian citizens. The forms of rescue have become reasons for further intervention and is not only to form a second antinomy, but it becomes another form of the logic of what Nancy Fraser has called globalized governmentality. The extant conditions of malnutrition, food insecurity, and overall conditions of underdevelopment and violence then legitimize the intervention of international philanthropic foundations, agencies, and groups, both into these rural areas and to what are called vulnerable populations. While Live Aid, that is international pop groups going to rescue starving peasants of Africa, especially in West Africa, the 1980s was made popular. Other groups such as Red Cross, World Food Programme, and even religious organizations have seen both huge crises, especially either drought-led or loss of crops or famine related to war, has opportunities to provide, to get into or to claim to provide relief, especially in these emergency conditions. Such corporate-led philanthropy is also remaking agriculture in a significant way. Leading some of these corporate-led philanthropies are the Rockefeller and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which alone have allocated close to $1 billion for Africa alone, seeing Africa as now the starving belt of the world in which remaking its agriculture would actually address all the problems. The project known as Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, led primarily by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, actually promotes high technologies, biotechnology-based solutions to agricultural food security problems in Africa. It overlooks the tremendous and voluminous data and research that indicates the problems that Green Revolution, especially in South Asia, has engendered. It also continues, the Agra initiative promotes corporate interests and investments, and as Walt Gimenez in a very thorough review and critique of the Agra initiative points out, Agra's alliance does not allow peasant farmers to be principal actors in agricultural development. The Rockefeller and Gates Foundation consulted with the world's largest seed and fertilizer companies, big philanthropy and multilateral development agencies, but they have yet to let peasant farmer organizations represent their views on the kind of agricultural development they believe will benefit them the most.
Media people, you can sit here. No, you can invite it.
It's always open to
Press people. Can I show?
It's always open to everyone.
Rescue measures include not only that of massive relief and rescue missions during famines or large food scarcity or violence, but also that of government itself in initiating what is called welfare governmentality. In India itself, this was expedited not because there was a huge crisis of since 1997 to about 2012, nearly 200,000 farmers, agriculturists committing suicide, not just over loss of crops but over also loss of livelihood itself. But the response was to retain, having put agriculture and agriculturists into conditions of retrogression, was to retain their position as vote banks and to vote the government back to power. Formulated in 2004 at a time when the then government lost power, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program in India, in which farmers, agriculturists or people in rural areas are guaranteed 100 days of employment by the government per year per family, it has been a way in which has been a way to assuage both the sentiments of rural people, but also to garner votes for the state. In doing such, so this welfare governmentality has also become a way in which the government also continues to legitimize forms of what Kalyan Sanyal has described as accumulation by dispossession, and which David Harvey also describes for various parts of the world itself. So both a combination of rescue in terms of great distress by philanthropy, but also that by governments in which welfare governmentality has become different welfare governmentality, becomes part of globalized governmentality, visible and is one of the key antinomies that are evident. Some of it has seen has both populist measures. They address not just the extant conditions of malnutrition or loss of livelihood, but some ways reproduce and remake some of the structures of inequity. As with the programs which overlook the lack of regulatory mechanisms, some of these welfare programs are now constituting both not just the marginal, but constituting rural areas into new welfare mechanisms, the implications of which I think will only unfold over the coming few decades. If between the antinomies of retrogression and rescue, the interests of agriculturists have not been served, then we will have to reckon with what has been the impact of this logic of the global agendas or the logic of global governmentality of agriculture has been. I think the impact is not merely that of just these conditions, distress, which we've seen in malnutrition or famine or even outbreaks of war, but also in the production of what I call local depredation. And here I just want to elaborate a little bit on what I mean by local depredation. These include what is called the loss of figured worlds, which Arturo Escobar, writing both about development, the impact of development in various parts of the world, but also writing most recently about the loss of figured worlds in Colombia, speaks of these as locally situated, culturally constructed, socially organized worlds that make visible people's purposeful and reflective agencies, that is, the capacity to remake the world in which they live. So it has been this loss of figured worlds means the loss of local knowledge systems, the loss of plural agricultural formations and practices which have actually been viable over centuries and which are now being eroded literally overnight. In linked to this loss of figured world is what are complex emergencies. And the idea of complex emergencies I take from David Keene's important work in which he describes complex emergencies, not going beyond that of famines, as conditions of humanitarian crisis attendant with violent conflict. Such crises include the extension and the recrudescence of poverty, deprivation, and scarcity, but also violence. Afghanistan in many ways represents this complex emergency, although for many of us in popular media, Afghanistan is seen either as a victim of both wars between the then Soviet Union and now by the US, or as the site of terrorism or of religious fundamentalism-based terrorism. Very often no details are provided as to how the once sturdy Afghan, the Pathan who had even defeated Imperial Britain, is now being reduced to becoming a peasant terrorist, and Afghanistan's land use policies, land use, the links between people and land, and the interrelationships between different groups based on their land use itself have been overlooked. So in much as which, as the extent to which Afghanistan represents for us a complex emergency with implications not just for one nation or for a group of people, with having both global implications, requires us to look at how local depredations also lead to some kind of forms of global complex emergencies. Such complex emergencies also must be placed into become the extent to which increasingly people who are affected by such globalized governmentality treat such people not as citizens but as subjects, most often made into pathological people, or as patients who must be rescued by philanthropy, by aid, or by missionary activities. They are often even constructed as supplicants to whom national or international welfare programs, or sometimes even war to even prevent war is being deployed. And perhaps the most insignificant impact of such complex emergencies or local depredation, seen as also an antinomy of agriculture, is the extent to which I see especially an emergence of a new form of disadvantage, which I call interiorization of disadvantage. This form of interiorization of disadvantage results not only from the loss of these figured worlds of knowledge systems, but is attendant with a loss of a sense of community itself among people, in which loss of both inherited local knowledge forms are made redundant by new forms of knowledge systems, especially driven by high commerce and high forms of capital, leading both to a disarray of identities, either not just primordial identities that have evolved over centuries, also to a loss of their agency to be or to be in charge of their own lives, and in which everything about themselves is turned negative. It's a dependency that then becomes a dependency on external sources which people themselves construct as inevitable. I think the impact of some of these, what I call as the interiorization of disadvantage among many people, and this I have been observing as expedited, especially of the past 2 decades in India also, is to be seen in various forms. For example, the lack of resistance among rural people. One of the questions that has been raised in India about the suicides has been why, if over the past 15 years, so many people are resorting to suicide. Why is it, if there are problems in agriculture, people have not formed associations and organizations? Why are there no forms of resistance? Why have people not rebelled? For example, data shows that at the heights of colonialism itself in 1870s or so, when farmers were, faced with increased revenue collections, when they had lost crops, they had actually rebelled. Some of the Deccan riots, etc., or the riots in India were actually based on what were called negative policies. But if the current policies have been so negative, then why have peasants all over the world, with some exemptions are just the Latin American peasants, why have Southeast Asian peasants, African peasants, or farmers and peasants in India not rebelled, or why have there not been forms of resistance? I think is because there is this interiorization of disadvantage. Linked to that is also the opting out of agriculture, reflected in the huge amounts of migration that you are having across nations, in which has, the United Nations itself documents human voluntary migration and opting out of agriculture to be one of the most significant shifts that are taking place in the world. There is also then a submission to such agendas, and in which linked to the disarray, displacement of livelihoods, disarray in identities and the loss of knowledge systems, a rise of increasing documentation of what the Komarovs, Jean and John Komarov, have reported in Africa, but also seen in parts of Latin America, parts of South Asia also, into called the occult economies in which magic is invoked only because people displaced from their earlier livelihoods or not fitted into the dominant rising livelihoods or economies, then resort to performing magic, or for example, magic is associated with creating money, or with stealing, or with what are called illegalities increasing, both in not only the sale of goods, but also in the purchasing of body parts and in various forms of illegal trades. So these are forms of local depredation, that is the loss of figured worlds, the increasing kinds of complex emergencies, and an interiorization of disadvantage. And I think some of these results of all of this, which we see in increasing migration, loss of lack of resistance, and in opting out. For example, in India itself, a study showed that about 40% of agriculturists did not want to be in agriculture anymore, and said that the next generation they wanted their children to be in other livelihoods. I think it is these kinds of trends that accounts for the fact that in 2007, the world registered for the first time more population in the urban areas rather than in rural areas, seen as a very significant marker in world history. If this is the trend, we must link it, at least parts of it, it is partly this results partly from the rampant not only depredations of rural and agrarian worlds, but it also requires us to pay not only closer attention to agrarian issues, but to include them in understanding in some of the ways in which there is a significant and emerging global orders. So it is in these in which we must see that what I started with Anna Singh's idea that the charisma of social science of globalism needs to see rural and agrarian issues not merely a footnote, given that other issues are often seen as topical or fashionable, but they be recentered and relinked to the emergence of multiple forms of cultural and political formations, and to the ways in which the agriculturists and the rural cannot just be wished away despite the dominant globalized agendas. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vasavi. She's covered a range of issues starting from the global antinomies at different levels, and she also showed us how you see there are contradictory push and pull by way of retrogressive policies and rescue mechanisms by way of governance, welfare measures. So there's a opposite. While we want to advocate welfare and governance measures for the rural, then but the agricultural is undermined through various commercialization and other forms of international trade. And she put forth the idea of knowledge dissonance and between the lay and the expert knowledge of agriculture, and how it leads to an interiorization of disadvantage, as she put it. Also a crisis of identity, which is produced not only by loss of land, life and livelihoods, but also a lot of, you see, loss of hope with what was certain to them in terms of culture, knowledge and so on. That all their knowledge of land, ecology, climate, everything doesn't seem to work. And so there is, that's what she calls as interiorization of disadvantage, if I understood correctly. So, and how all this has led to a crisis. So it's not enough to talk only about urbanization or migration, but we have to look and pay attention to what is happening to the agriculturists, which includes farmers of all categories. Now it's open to questions. Please feel free to ask questions, comments, observations and clarifications.
In the context of India, so there is a large number of farmers are committing suicide. And Subhash Palekar comes from Maharashtra, and he he says that only way to escape from this farmer committing suicide is, he says, zero budget natural farming. Without anything, even 1 acre, he says at most you can spend 100 rupees, not more than that. You can you can come out of it, he says. What do you think?
Shall we take a few questions probably if you answer this question, that will be
Yeah. Yeah.
In some ways, I think he's right, but I don't know. I mean, I know of the Palekar's method, zero budget or zero cultivation method. I think we cannot see that as just one single solution or an alternative to this dominant one, which is commercial, the green revolution model. Because of the diversity of ecological terrains and diversity of crops and the ways in which different farming systems have evolved, we'd have to look at localized forms also. But I think what is important in the Palekar method is the fact that commercial or external inputs are minimized. Yeah, and so I think that is one of the keys, and what people are seeing as community-based sustainable agriculture is also one of the methods. The challenge that we would face, not just India, but many countries in which holdings are very small. For example, in India, the average size of holding is only 1.33 hectares per cultivating household. And it is also similarly very small in parts of Africa and in parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia. What we need to look at is not just independent cultivation, but much more cooperative and collective forms of cultivation itself. So right now we have methods in which you can cultivate in one small plot, but you would also face other problems. For example, in marketing, or in storing, or getting capital in context where you need capital, etc. So I think a combination of the actual content of the method with the larger social structures also need to be changed. For a country like in India, where the caste system continues to be the basis of the agrarian social structure, we need to address that also in a very substantial way. So just critiquing the green revolution or new methods is not enough. We need to look at alternatives that also look at alternative social structures.
It needs to be an alternative. You don't have to buy anything, even seeds also, even technology, anything. Just you have to go only to selling only. You have to go, capitalist system. In everything you will get, in the village only. You don't have to depend on anything, anybody. That's what it is.
That's an ideological position, so would you like to say something about your work on schooling, because the relationship between agriculture and medical schooling, that's where you contribute to the painting. So would you like to respond to one form of ideology and its location in terms of other ideologies? That's interesting.
What we are seeing is this commercialization or capitalization of agriculture is also attended with the privatization of several services. For example, what we've seen in health and education. So take for example, although the right to education has just been, 2009 has been made free and compulsory, and larger numbers of children are getting into schools and schools have spread. We also have a concomitant trend, which is the growth of private schools and privatization of education. So I think unless we address these in the context of both agriculture and at least elementary education, if we could see these as state-led or ways in which collective interests and needs are served rather than those made fragmented, that would be much more important. Not many people know that India has the world's most diversified elementary education system. We have something like 11 types of schools catering to us. There are 9 types of examination boards just at the school level, all of which completely coincide with a very hierarchical and differentiated socio-economic, society or social structure itself. So no matter how much the idea of making schooling available is on the rhetoric of fostering the equality, it cannot be because you're providing unequal education. As is with agriculture, there is capitalization that is being encouraged. At the same time, you have this rhetoric of retrogression, which is asking small and marginal cultivators to get out. It then makes it easier for larger players to come in. So in some ways, what you said between agriculture and education, you see these trends, a rhetoric of change, development, equality, but also actual structures that encourage privatization and differentiation. This is going in and out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just commenting on some of the observations we had made about farming. I was just wondering, where do you fit in certain groups like the landless laborer? See, in this model, you seem to be talking about a farmer, whereas it does appear to us that there are many other categories beside the farmer who are also part of this agricultural scenario, which don't seem to feature in this discussion you're making. One is this kind of group of landless laborers. The other thing is that the point you made about why is there no resistance from within the agricultural sector, whatever. And you had given those examples of the 19th century and then looking at what it is today. I mean, one of the observations I think that one can make as a counterpoint to this is that because the agrarian sector is so fractured and so fructified, and the way you rightly put it, it is so divided along caste lines and all that. I mean, there has never actually been a successful attempt at organizing labor, whatever, in that sense, in the rural areas, whatever. What there has been is organizing interest groups, like even if you take the case we are talking about of the farmer suicide thing. If you look at it in Maharashtra, for example, the cotton farmers in various regions are very well organized, and they are able to even fight to get a good payment for their thing, whatever. But it's not as if they are politicized to the level where they want to turn this issue into a larger concern with agriculture as well, whatever. See? So I mean, is that something that is intrinsic to the very nature of agricultural activity, in the sense not only in India but in the rest of the world as well, whatever? Because we somehow seem to have a real problem at the level of mobilizing and organizing labor in that sense. Because with the landless labor being a very, very important category there.
Respond? Yeah, thank you. You're right, I didn't look at landless laborers because I was focusing so much on agriculture. But what is interesting in India, especially in this period of expedited commercialization and capitalization, is that, and linked now more recently to the implementation of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, is the real wages have actually gone up. On an average, in many of these areas, especially in the so-called suicide belts, the conditions of landless laborers is better than that of the conditions of marginal and small farmers. So if you did not get into the speculative economy, did not borrow and take all these risks into agriculture, but you were able to have a livelihood based only on selling your labor, you are actually better off. All data is actually showing that across India, real wages for landless agricultural laborers has gone up. In fact, documentation of improvements in lifestyles, life conditions is also much better. But this I qualify because this is true only for certain belts in which there is either boom economies, in which, for example, in all the southern states, the construction and boom economy has meant large numbers are migrating out and are actually getting both employed there and are able to then have this remittance economy to sustain their families in the rural areas. So that's one of the reasons why I did not look at landless laborers, but I have actually touched on this in my book. But and you've rightly pointed out, it's a very important category and something that needs much more attention. The other thing is to also to look at the extent to which, given the increasing loss of land among marginal and small agriculturists, many of them are becoming new landless laborers. And what is happening to them is something that we need to look at much more closely. This issue of why no resistance, and I think you've actually answered this query itself, that the agrarian social structure is so fractured that even in the post-independence movement, in the post-colonial phase, we've really not had a substantial all-India agrarian front or anybody. We've had regional levels, for example, the Raita Sangha in Karnataka or the Tikait, another group, Bharatiya Kisan Union here in North. But very restricted to regions and very periodic and has been subject to tremendous fluctuations and have also been very personality based, and therefore with the death of the leaders, the movements have also collapsed. But I think what is interesting is that, and you've rightly said, some farmers are able to mobilize. Even the earlier farmers' movements we know were actually led by so-called progressive farmers who were lobbying for more, parity of pay, increased subsidies, including water, electricity, etc., rather than the interests of small and marginal farmers. But one of the interesting trends is the question that we need to ask: if India is so predominantly rural and agrarian, and we are voting on this basis, and we're actually voting in large numbers of people into the parliament, large numbers of people who have agrarian and rural backgrounds, then why then have they not upheld the interests of farmers itself? And very good studies are showing, because of the new economy, those who have been voted into power are actually becoming part of the neoliberal state, in which capital garnering and in which it is almost understood that elections are literally bought with huge amounts of money. They are going into huge money-making rackets. The other interesting thing is showing that those who have been voted to power, even with the agricultural backgrounds, have actually seen that as only a vote position, as a social position, but the economic activities are into trade and to speculative economies, commerce, into, for example, real estate interests or into construction, etc. So they really then don't have the interests of the average agriculturist or rural resident in mind. But I think what we are also seeing is the extent to which the disarray in agriculture is also accounting for this. For example, just last month, large numbers of people met outside Mysore and they were talking about revitalizing the national agrarian movement. We heard the litany of the same problems, but what would be the strategies to mobilize people is nobody had a way at all. I think the disconnect between leaders and their own leaders and the life conditions in rural areas is so significant. The other is this fracturing that you see is not only fractured across access or by caste, but also by the vast number of political parties we have. I mean, it is impossible in the village where we live in and we work in. Almost every 6 months we have a small party coming into being, asking for people's attention, for their vote, for their support. So that fracturing is also taking place on a political basis. I think the only positive story that we are hearing is quite unexpectedly actually in Tamil Nadu, which is also urbanizing at a very fast rate. In which there is some mobilization against the new land acquisition. There is also a lot of co-option that is taking place. People actually want to get rid of the land. There is no resistance. But because the land loss is becoming so significant and very, very visible, there is some amount of mobilization across groups, large holders versus small marginal holders, forming into the new groups and farmer organizations, and also organizing to form what are called organic movements. I think some of the hope actually lies in this, where a completely different alternative is being promoted. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I like to little bit disagree here.
Yeah.
When people say that there is less resistance in the agriculture sector, then I say that it is about a perspective. For example, I am doing a research on POSCO, India, in which for the last 8 years people are resisting to resist the establishment of POSCO India. And the main point of resistance is the diversion of the forest land into non-forest use. And why they are doing it? Because the dependency on the forest land in terms of agriculture is so high, so they cannot afford to lose it because it is basic on the sustainability. So when we look at the paradigm in which there is production, consumption, market, and which is like in a different way, but when we leave out like a chunk which is about sustainability, which is it has nothing to do with exchange, then how do you put this question? And in the context when there is no exchange, there the politics become different, because since there is no exchange, so the question that whether it is an agriculture land and how much it is relevant to the market, people don't address it. They put it in a way of like development. It is more about like land acquisition. It is more about forest. But when you go into the field, you actually figure out that it is much more to do with agriculture. It is much more to do with like about sustenance. Maybe it is a government land like forest land, but like this survivability is very like ratio or a degree in which the local community can survive on the land is very high. And apart from that, and since there is no other resources, so how do you look at this thing? And for last 8 years in that area, there has been a long struggle.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I think POSCO and the resistance to the mining groups is very important and significant, but we actually have to see it as an exception. For example, if you take the extent to which all the mining and land acquisition that is taking place across the country, there's been no resistance. Take, for example, just where we are, Delhi, Noida, the whole development of the Haryana belt and the Uttar Pradesh, Noida belt, the loss of land has been so significant, but we've actually not seen resistance at all. This very good example, for example, just 2 years ago, outside Chandigarh, they were going to auction off land, agricultural land, to form a new airport. All officials, people were actually prepared for resistance. You would not believe it, the auction started at 10 o'clock and they closed by 1 o'clock because all the farmers were so willingly sold out the land. The land was going for crores. So as you rightly put it, the exchange value far exceeds what they would have got by their livelihood. That's only one. But there is also tremendous forms of co-option. What we have been documenting as accumulation by co-option. The whole Bellary belt which stood out in Karnataka, huge amounts in which people who, illegal mining lords becoming ministers, I think only because there was this dispersal of this, illegal wealth through, popular methods, having mass marriages, distributing houses, setting up schools, having hospitals, etc. Charitable acts and forms of some kind of gratis, an economy that was formed around these people, meant there has been no resistance at all. So I think POSCO and a few belts here and there actually are exceptions. For example, something that people have been very surprised with, Kerala's long history of mobilizing people, against not only the state but also against, capital groups or interests. The making of the so-called smart cities, Cochin into smart city with the new seafront, making of the smart city in outside Mumbai, many areas, etc. Hyderabad, there has been no resistance at all. So what we need to really look at is to understand much more what are the trends. Why, for example, all the details of the critique against the the land acquisition bill, the new one that was reformulated. You actually don't see much resistance. The spread of the special economic zones into even very rich cultivating belts in which there has been no resistance. What accounts for it right across the country. In fact, Goa is the only state which actually rejected the Special Economic Zones Act itself and threw it out because it was a state-based decision and sent it back to the center. Apart from this, no state has done this, mostly because people who are losing land from the Land Acquisition Act are not resisting itself. So as you've said, we need to look at what happens with this exchange value, but we also need to look at how this accumulation by dispossession is taking place, in which there is co-option, there is dispersal, there is the reformulation of political systems, and the reinstituting of new institutions to absorb forms of resistance.
Share an observation. When you talk about these experiences, here the state is the main player. The state as and the global discourses.
I think what I'm mentioning is, I missed the first part of your presentation, but what I understood is the implication of the global agenda and of course the complicity of the state in this whole process of dispossession. But I was just thinking of some states from the northeast, for instance, which are tribal dominated, and I have Nagaland in mind, where you have 92% of the land being owned by people, and state has very little control. And there, what I saw recently, a few years back, 3-4 years back, is how the global discourse itself, the state has very little role, but the global discourse, as you say, of moving away from agriculture, creating those different kind of alternative structures. The people themselves are engaged in, especially the elites, are engaged in mining in their own land, in their own hills, and there's a whole, huge ecological destruction is going on. A lot of, the land is being replaced from horticultural land to other purposes, for instance, making tourist parks or other things. So in a sense that these communities, which were traditionally not as heterogeneous, are becoming more, heterogeneous. And the elite is, playing as what state would play in other, and elite is also part of the state in some sense. They are the politicians, they are the, capitalists, neo-capitalists or so on. So in a sense that, what kind of, here there is no scope of resistance also, because they are destroying their own land. So in a sense that, it's part of that global discourse that we see, that they probably, do we say that they are not rational, or, they can't see the rational, any rationale in destroying their own ecology. And so what kind of new, structures are emerging where even in those, when we talk about indigenous rights and when we talk about indigenous knowledge systems, if the people themselves are, killing and destroying that, then how much of state complicity that we see here?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a very important and interesting example. The fact that Nagaland actually has this act of community-owned resources and decision-making also, but bypasses this. What I tried to do in the first part of my lecture was to speak about this globalized governmentality, which deploys its own logic and rationale, which is part of this, in which it co-opts the elite or co-opts those people in power and decision-making positions into its rationale and logic, and that is what we are seeing. And I mean, you've described it so well, so I only just want to qualify that I did talk about this. And we are seeing this, I spoke a little bit about how national policies are made to reflect transnational interests also, giving some of the examples, in which both compromise either scientists or administrators, now consultants, and politicians as key decision makers actually co-opted to it. Mining policy is one of the most well-known examples, where we've had a central minister sitting on the board of a transnational mining company, in which we also overlooked such, what are called conflicting interests taking place.
So we've had some discussion on resistance and absence of resistance to some of the processes that you're talking about. So we had some discussion on absence of resistance to the processes that you were talking about, and you spoke about, so as came up in the discussion, there are various structural factors also, but also what you mentioned as what you call an interiorization of disadvantage. where resistance in some ways is not an option or not seen as an option, and you're seeing this manifested in a huge number of farmers' suicides. So this is the action in lieu of resistance or organizing or agitating, etc. But what you've also talked about in some of the examples in which you've mentioned is how people themselves seem to be taking advantage of the kind of new options that are coming their way. And this isn't only about, elites directing policy in a certain way, etc., but about actual people, the actual people who are going to have to give up their land, who seem to be quite willing to do it. And why that is, what kind of ideas they have in mind, the short-term benefits, long-term benefits, all of that is also something that has to be considered. But there seem to be two kind of parallel things which are coming in this discussion. One is a situation where people cannot resist, and the other is a situation where people seem to want to resist. So if you could just talk about this a bit.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. One of the trends for the new opting out, which I also described, is that seeing agriculture or agrarian livelihoods as being futile and not really worth it. The other is the new forms of education that have spread, even if it is very basic, means that they really should be into another economy, and the legitimizing role that the promotion of the new economies are playing. But it's also linked to the increasing mediatization of society, where through media, especially, what you're seeing in India is happening, that now even the poorest village or poorest household has access to n number of television channels, etc. New aspirations, new lifestyles itself, in which has been known all of our media representations of successful life is a non-agrarian life. So I think a combination of this has meant that the agricultural, the rural is really not your best option. It is only those who are so tremendously disadvantaged, who have no options, are actually being left behind. I don't know if you read Harsh Mandar's essay, which is last week, which was in the Hindu, which speaks about the despondency in the rural areas. Everybody wants to be out. And that is what we are seeing in vast belts, that the very elderly, or it is women and children who are being left behind, and men are just migrating out. But there is also this trend of opting out to be, one of the things why we are registering higher sales of land with the opening up of the market, voluntary sales also, is we're going to sell this land to invest in something, preferably children's education, or to purchase a seat in a engineering college for a son, or a medical college seat for a daughter, something like that. So investments are also becoming non-agricultural, non-rural. And I think this really explains both not only the non-resistance, but also the opting out that we are seeing in agriculture.
My data shows for Kerala that it's essentially because consumption. So the fact that a whole new generation has been inducted into the space which is represented, and which then does all possible socialization into agriculture. But what is interesting in response, and I think one of Vivek's students had a paper on this in the PhD seminar 2 years ago, which was on the new type of farmer, the new farmer. The farming is of interest, and I think even in the synopsis presentations for entry into JNU, one of the candidates had spoken about farming as an alternative educational space. And I think that's what I'm following up in Tamil Nadu. And I'm glad that you raised the case of Tamil Nadu, because the whole question of organic farming has been represented in Kerala as interesting to the state, whatever its own residents may think. So we are talking about Gulf diaspora from all castes and all religions, which is now 40 years old, so they're returning to retire. So in some senses, even the question of their own children wanting Aranmala, which is one of the most beautiful agriculture spaces, and also in terms of tourism represents boating, ritual, craft economies, the famous 14th century mirrors, for instance. But there is a Gulf diaspora which wants an airport there, and it is going to be a private airport from what I understand. So the state is drawing private companies to represent the notion of their own sense of either industrialization or of internet technologies as being the alternative. The other thing I want to mention is the data which I have for people quoting, which I was drawn into by activists who wanted me to represent their case. So I have a paper which I hope I can read next week if it's not. Because I think when you say that there is the absence of response, and one of our PhD candidates here has spoken about POSCO, but I think even in terms of hydroelectric power, one of the most anxious spaces that citizens occupy is that the state doesn't give them a voice. So it's drawing in the lumpen proletariat as goons to really violate the spaces of citizenship and speech. And I think since you're in Karnataka, the use of political ideology in order to completely obliterate the spaces of alternative ways of thinking. Everybody has to fit into one particular kind of space. So even if there are farmers who may have a kind of response, the political ideology will then negotiate that response to be its own and only its own. And so if you look at the Ganga, the sense that the right wing takes it over as its own, which then creates shadow spaces for those who may be secular, who may be activists, who are not talking about agriculture as nostalgia, but agriculture as an ideological space which is worthy of following, but a new generation is ready to follow that up. So I think if we take the creative space of Kerala, where the idea of alternative farming is coming back as state policy, we might have some anchor which we can work with.
Is it working? It doesn't seem to be.
Ma'am, my observation will be about your this framework. When you connected it at the global level, this framework of globalized governmentality of Nancy Fraser, I feel it has the potentiality in this framework. It actually reduced many post-colonial societies, and it fixes the elite in certain type of stereotyping. Let's take the case of this Ethiopia and deal with Indian businessmen. So I am a little bit aware of this case. So Ethiopian government has denied the opportunity to Chinese. Americans were very keen there to come there. They only took Indians with had certain cultural perspective that maybe they are more honest. They will be not going to involve in interior politics. So I see Ethiopian as a government has taken a due consideration of the particularities of their own society. Now to take if the Nancy Fraser's framework of this globalizing governmentality, in a sense of it doesn't provide this historical potentiality within this historical agencies in different post-colonial societies to make an historical gelling in making any development strategy or any development move to get out of economic deprivation or cultural hegemony in the global field. So if it is read in only that sense, that will be stereotyping.
I was curious to know how you look at the question of gender with regard to the crisis with respect to two issues. One is we come to know that the trend is one of increasing enrollment of women in primary education in those states whose incomes are growing due to commercialization process. So how do you look at women's education and its growth in rural India and agrarian distress? Is there any connection? Second is if farmers are committing suicide and their women are taking up the burden of the family. Now, how do they cope with the same stresses? What do they do? Do we have some information on that count? Is something we would like to know. probably if you answer this, there would be some more discontent. Yeah.
Ma'am, could you please clarify what you mean by individualization of disadvantage because I couldn't get it well?
Shall I take this one? Yeah. Does it especially needs to go on this side? Would you like to speak from that mic? You have to switch that off. Now it is.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I think you sort of qualified and elaborated some of the things I've said, especially the new aspirations that come from mediatization, which is really conspicuous consumption. I just want to say what we are seeing in these trends of new farmers, it is there. And for example, the diaspora, the returned diaspora Indians from Punjab, Gujarat, and Kerala. These are the three key states in which you have people coming back. But they are not so much into cultivation, but they've come back and maybe they lease out the land, or some may cultivate, etc. And there is a trend of some people wanting to go. For example, there's a trend of IT professionals getting into land, big around Bangalore, around Hyderabad, etc. But I would see those as small. They may have some significance down the road, but they are very small compared to the opting out of agriculture of the masses. And that is what NSSO or the, even the 2011 census data, preliminary data showing large percentages actually declined. And one analysis shows something very sharp between 2001 to 2011 census, something like 20% of the marginal households have actually opted out of agriculture, which is very significant. So I think we need to balance that to see what is happening. But it's an important category of the new farmer, and it's something that we need to look out for. But I think the rise of the new farmer, if it gains, some sort of becomes a trend, I think it will resonate with what in the West was called the new rurality, where you had people who are metropolitan and then come back, and it becomes a lifestyle issue. Your actual source of livelihood is from somewhere else. Your money, your capital is actually not from agriculture or the rural, but you're assured enough to only have a lifestyle which is rural or agrarian. So I think we need to see what the implications of this will be for India, and I think some of it will emerge, at least in pockets, that would happen. This question about, you're very right about the limitations of phrases. In the beginning, I kind of qualified why I'm using globalized governmentality to look at both these antinomies, because they do come from these agents or organizations or institutions which are seeking to govern agriculture and both integrating into the new economy or responding to massive crises. But I don't think Fraser in all her work, not only in this context of this, denies agency. I think one of what I would see as very insightful of Fraser is the extent to which she is also conscious of very non-Western trends, etc. But you're right in the extent to which different situations would require us to give explanation, because even within in India we would have something so different. For example, if we see what's happening in Orissa with the anti-POSCO movement and the mining belt, is so different from what has been happening in Karnataka. Completely different case stories, and we need different theoretical frameworks to explain this within the country. So I think theoretically we need to be ready to be eclectic, and I was just using this as a framework but not a completely locating my study within phrase. I use it only in that very specific context. Gender, Sujata, I think this is a bit difficult because the link, it is true, there is an increase in investing in the girl child to go to school, not only because it is made compulsory, because the family sizes have decreased. There are trends in which families have only girls, or girls are seen as being worthy of being educated and later being employed also. For example, a very good study in Rajasthan talks about how girls who have dropped out from school, 7th, 8th standard, but have actually been married, early marriage. Large numbers of them are now being sent by their own parents to be trained as nurses and these highly qualified nannies, trained, retrained to be domestic help, slightly upper level, not like old labor. So because now they can read and write. So basic education itself, changing the labor profile is what we're seeing, especially for girls. which were not actually documented for boys so much, has some forms of both mobility and opportunities that have been created. Agrarian distress, there have also been women who have committed suicide, women who are in charge of their plots, and I've documented this, but more women have been widows because there have been a larger proportion of men. What happens to these widows is a very different story. For example, Ranjana Paddi's work on Punjab looks only at the status of widows and children after the men have died and what has happened. It's a sorry, very pathetic state. Very few have got their state-based compensation. Very few are able to retain their livelihoods. A lot of children have been withdrawn from schools or some even from colleges where, in Maharashtra where you have large proportions going to colleges, local colleges, etc. So the forms of distress actually continue in context of suicide. Some have actually become bonded laborers. Some go into new forms of indebtedness. Some are completely displaced. Some actually migrate out from the villages because they still owe local debts. And the man isn't there to repay it or they have no livelihood. So in Karnataka I've documented absolute, completely giving up the village or the household and going away. So it's very complex, but I think much more studies need to be made on this, especially those belts, say Maharashtra and Andhra, where we are witnessing suicides even now. The past few months have recorded larger numbers of suicide, but something that people need to pay attention to. The person at the back, what I meant by interiorization of disadvantage is to look at the extent to which the multiple losses that people face is not only just outside external loss of livelihood, of land, or resources, or forming into the loss of a figured world, which I spoke about, Escobar described so well, or into getting into complex emergencies. It is where large groups of people, because of the multiple erosions they face, it is your livelihood is eroded, your knowledge base is eroded, your identity is eroded, you lose a sense of belonging to the community you were born in, the community you were supposed to belong to, and not only, it's not just a simple form of alienation, but you feel that everything that you have is worthless. So it becomes an internalization of disadvantage where there is non-recognition of one's own skills and abilities. You lose your sense of agency also. So linked to this interiorization I spoke about has also been the reason why people want to opt out, want to migrate, or you decide not to resist, has been in a hopeless situation. It's also the extent to which what was feasible before or for your parents or even earlier is no longer feasible, and therefore you must submit to certain larger agendas in which you don't really have any agency at all. In my work, I have earlier very strongly feel that we should not see suicide as resistance. I think the resistance literature, right from James Scott, etc., is not amenable to understanding such a situation. Suicides have been political stands. They have been where people have written long letters addressed to the Prime Minister, to the Chief Minister, have addressed it to the local people and said, I'm dying, I'm committing suicide because of this has happened. I criticize this, I feel ashamed of this, etc. But therefore, they take a political stand. They say, they are people who are powerful, you've not done anything, I'm powerless, etc. But I don't see it as a form of resistance. I think I would advise caution on that. But it's my reading that it's really not a form of resistance.
Ma'am, I just within this debates of discourses of agrarian distress and agrarian crisis, and as we know, like classical writings of Marxian using Marxian framework, and Lenin's writings on development of capitalism in Russian agriculture and so on, vis-a-vis this whole idea of emergence of new capitalists and the the whole politics of development. How do we see what is happening to the whole category and concept of the rural and village? How do we make sense of it? Because the dominant idea of village that we have been reading and is like village means where agriculture is being done, and now the whole idea is that people are moving out of agriculture, moving out of farming. So how do we whether this category is helpful or in what sense? The second question is like when we talk about this no absence of any resistance, towards this new development that is taking place, do we need to differentiate between farmers' movements, which has a totally different agenda for price war or wage war, or from the peasants' mobilization, peasants' resistance, which is kind of being marked out as the only exception to within bringing framework of farmers' movement? Because as we have already said, that opting out of dominant caste from the farmers category is resulting into the decline of farmers' movement, as we see already in some regional cases. So how do we whether it is possible to differentiate, and how is useful for us?
Thank you. Very important question. I hesitate to locate my work or this reading of what is happening in rural agrarian India or elsewhere into a purely Marxist framework. One, I mean, there are multiple reasons. For example, the classic debates, Lenin, Trotsky and others were focusing on transition so much, and I think we have gone beyond the agrarian question as only a process of transition. It's much more complex. That is one. The other is the key issue of class itself. Class is so ambiguous here because not only because class is so closely intermeshed with caste, where caste and class coincide, but because of the fluidity in those situations and the complexities in their positions make, rendering of all these groups into specific classes very, very, very difficult. And I think what is important and what you very rightly flag is therefore the rural and the village has new categories, have to be understood in very different ways from what we understood it earlier as either sites of civilization or sites of residence, and agriculture is only a livelihood, or agriculture has categories of economic actors, etc. It's in this new categorization we will have to factor in the new complexities. For example, all these marginal people who are losing their agriculture-based income are also diversifying, combining sale of labor, combining what are called non-agricultural livelihoods. For example, large proportion of the Haryana Punjab belt, it is non-farm economic activities that is the basis of the household economy itself. So how do we look at these new combinations, clusters of new occupations that are coming into being? For example, we are documenting in the south especially the rise of a new rural service economy, large numbers of people who actually service tractors and tillers, telecommunications, retail trade, cable network, all the new things that are coming into the rural areas, a new kind of service economy completely displacing the earlier caste-based service economy. And that is something that then makes the rural and the village, for us to understand it in very different categories or terms. The other trend is the new geospatial data, which has actually gone above other data, is showing that there are clusters of sites that are neither purely urban nor rural. That is also because you have now new huge construction sites or called urban village, but really they should be something else. What is this? Because when you say urban and village, you immediately have the earlier images coming into place. What are these new sites that are coming into being? What kind of livelihoods, lives are they? What are they as composite places to be studied? So I think those are the trends that we're documenting and things that we need to study much more. About farmers' movements and other movements, as I said earlier also, we need to be qualified this, that those farmers' movements, especially led by dominant farmers or so-called commercial farmers versus other movements, need to be differentiated. Right now we are not seeing a cohesive collective movement coming into play. But what are the terms that are used and what are the terms by which they are being mobilized also is important to look at. For example, the new movement across the Karnataka and Tamil Nadu belt is actually vis-a-vis access to the Kaveri waters, because the water issue has just become a key issue. Is that a common theme? Then it overrides caste and regional differences. But each state becomes one against the other. So again, they cannot come together as one farming group because they are actually literally contesting over the same resource. So I think those, if we factor in some of these complexities, how would we see the farmers' movement is something that I think we need to go beyond the 80s and 90s new farmers movements and look at really the 21st century farmers movements that are coming into being with increased financialization and capitalization of agriculture.
Ma'am, you just on that question of suicide, would you call self-immolation done by Tibets in last 2 years, more than Tibetans have done more than 200 have done self-immolation. Would it require in category of at least a career protest? It should be taken as a protest.
Yeah, that is a political act. Yeah, I agree that the suicide or self-immolation by Tibetans is very much a political act, because after all their calling attention is to a political condition. No? So I would differentiate these two. I don't see and it's a very strong political act, and there is a long history of that.
I would like to reflect upon the complicated relationship between science, local practices, and rationality. Because as we know, it is always
Local practices and rationality.
as you know, it is always the scientists at IARI, people from the Ministry of Science and Technology decides how and what should a scientist come up practice. Because, for example, when I was visiting the University of Agriculture in Bangalore, I realized that they actually have programs where they invite farmers from all parts of Karnataka and teach them what to do and what not to do. So I was wondering if the scientists are also learning from them. I mean, I'm thinking that it is always, always the disconnection between science and practice when it comes to agriculture.
Yeah, what see one
like Shimada Rose cognitive justice.
yeah.
Paulo Freire. So Paulo Freire, this is pedagogy of both. The people teach the science.
No, I think one of the problems with the mainstream or establishment scientists are that they don't recognize other sciences. They think there is only one science. And within this context, there are at least two problems. The agricultural universities in India were set up on what is called the lab to land basis. That you do experiments in the lab and then transfer it to the land. It is not the land to lab which alternative plural agrarian systems or the people who are writing about alternatives or multiple forms of knowledge systems are looking at. The second is the extent to which scientists are deeply compromised. The inter-council report which was on BT, which is, for others, this was a report done by all the science academies in India, which they actually cut and pasted, plagiarized a Monsanto report justifying BT, and then other groups actually found out and said, look, you've taken sentence by sentence, word by word, and you call yourself representing the scientist thing. And it was a complete, this was really a moment of deep shame for scientists in the country, but they didn't even apologize, no heads were knocked off, people continued in the same positions, etc. So apart from the idea that science is the Western based, the rational, logical and one dominant science, the non-recognition of multiple forms in which you have agricultural universities doing this is the co-option. So I think what we are seeing is this double betrayal that is happening, and there's so many. The agricultural universities themselves, for example, fudging data over BT cotton, fudging data about brinjal, about production of farms. For example, some people who talked to us have said that in all the debates about suicides, the agricultural scientists have been completely silenced, as to say it is not their business at all. Why is it then it was the promotion of hybrid seeds, of a particular model of agriculture, of the excessive use of local resources, all of these were problematic, but none of these are now reflected in the agricultural university. Instead it is civil society organizations, a few groups that are looking at alternatives. So I think the compromise and the problem and the very the establishment's comfort in being sustained in its privilege really accounts for this betrayal. So I think looking for cognitive justice or for these ideas of hope should be outside of the larger the establishment itself.
Last year. Yes.
It's not a question, but I just want to interact. As you have said that the main work, objective of the agriculture scientists, they work on the basis of the lab to land program. So I want to say that you didn't mention about the extension workers, agriculture extension workers, as one of the most important part of the rescuing agriculture, because the agriculture extension workers, they play a main task in bridging the gap between the agriculture scientists and the farmers. So I just wanted to add it.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Typically, but all extension workers have been reduced. That has been one of the problems. The numbers, there's been absolutely lack of recruitment, especially since the 1990s itself. And this actually been minimized. It's the corporate, the transnational agribusiness extension workers who have a stronger presence now in rural India than the government's extension workers, and that's been documented very well. But you're right, they do mediate, but they mediate in transferring knowledge in toto. They reproduce, and I've actually documented this in my study, where I've actually detailed conversations in which they tell agriculture, you're a fool if you follow this, polyculture. You must be systematic. You must follow uniform methods. You must use hybrid seeds. You must purchase certain kinds of fertilizers and pesticides. So they're not so much capitalists as much as they're minions in a very large bureaucracy, and they just reproduce what they're told. There is no justification, there is no qualification of local conditions at all.
Thank you, Professor Vasavi, for very patiently engaging with all the questions. And thank you all for your keen participation and very interesting questions. I also take this opportunity to thank Ashish Kumar, GSP student coordinator, for making the logistics possible, our office staff for making the administrative support. And this will also, the recording of this whole session will be available very soon at the DSA library in the form of a CD for those of you who want to pay attention. And next week, Thursday, we have the next lecture in the GSP annual lecture series, but it will be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And there's one more on 28th, 3 consecutive Thursdays on issues related to globalization, labor, and so on. So thank you once again, and have a nice day.